Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, all. Paul Risley, will you be quiet, please? Hi, I'm Gwen Robinson, Nikkei Asian Review Editor-at-Large and President of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, and I'm very happy to welcome tonight Andreas Harsono. And before I give you a short introduction, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping announcements to remind you of a couple of upcoming things we've got. Unusually, the club, for a rare occasion, is going to stage a play next week, a theatre performance of a small play that has had great reviews called My Mother's Kitchen, which is in Thai and English but has subtitles for both. And it will be on August the 1st. And there's more information about that in our bulletin, and on the web you can see the reviews. So I highly recommend that if you're at a loose end on August the 1st, please come along. You're getting a very good price as well here on that. And on August the 7th, we're hoping to have the new Thai Education Minister to talk about education in Thailand. And he has, in principle, agreed. So we hope that will come off. And this Friday, for correspondent members, or actually probably any member who's interested, Go Air of India, the No Frills airline, is going to have an event here at midday to announce its new routes, which involve Thailand as well. Free food and drink, by the way, including beer, apparently. But anyway, one to keep in mind. And anyway, turning to the event of the evening, as you can see on the screen there, we're having a look to hearing tonight about Andreas Harsono's new book, Race, Islam and Power in Indonesia. And you've got the handout, but just to recap, Andreas is one of the best-known analysts, commentators and activists in Indonesia, and since 2008 he's covered Indonesia for Human Rights Watch. But he's spent much of his career as a journalist and also dealing with media, beginning as a reporter for the Bangkok-based Nation newspaper, but based in Jakarta. But he was just telling me that he was also covering Burma for the Nation in those years because it was so hard for the Nation to get Thai reporters into Myanmar then. So that was an initiation by fire into the world of journalism. And then he moved to the Kuala Lumpur-based Star newspapers. Before joining Human Rights Watch, he helped found the Jakarta-based Institute for the Studies on Free Flow of Information in 1995, and in 2003 helped create the Pantau Foundation, a journalist training organisation based in Jakarta. A champion of media rights and free press, he's also helped establish Jakarta's Alliance of Independent Journalists in 1994 and Bangkok's Southeast Asia Press Alliance in 1998. After his earlier stints with the Nation and Star newspapers, he edited Pantau, the monthly magazine on media and journalism in Jakarta and in Indonesian Malay. His published books include a couple of Indonesian language books, and this is a major book by him, which is the culmination, as you'll hear, of more than, I think, 15 years, or is it 17 years of 15 years only of interviews and travel throughout Indonesia. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Andreas, and after that, please, we'll have a discussion and feel free to ask questions. Oh, and the book is on sale there, and while it's 600 baht for a paperback, that happens to be a 30% discount from what the publisher Monash University is selling it for. So it is a very good deal to buy it here tonight. And Andreas would be happy to sign it. Anyway, after that plug, over to you, Andreas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will be very quick with this PowerPoint just to refresh you about what happened in Indonesia over the last 20 years. This is a brief description about the book. You have read them all. And this is the beginning of the book. This is the resignation of President Suharto that changed the situation, the equilibrium in Indonesia, May 1998, after being in power for 33 years, 3 decades. So I made the book as a travelogue from Aceh in the western tip of Sumatra Island, hopping from one island to another, a total of 5 years, and ending in Papua. From the north to the south, of course. This is some ethnic data of Indonesia. Javanese originate from Java. It is the largest ethnic group in Indonesia. All Indonesian presidents, Soekarno, Suharto until now, President Jokowi, are all Javanese. And the second largest ethnic group is Sundanese, 15% of the population. The third Malay, the fourth Maduris, Batak is the fifth. It is the largest predominantly Christian ethnic group in Indonesia. And then the rest are also Muslim. So of all these 10 largest ethnic groups, 9 are Muslim dominated. And Batak, originating from around Lake Toba in Sumatra, is the largest predominantly Christian. What I would like to argue in that book is that Muslim also kill Muslim. So what we heard are always about Muslim killing Christian or Christian killing Muslim. Here in Indonesia, they are fighting one against another, of course. Oh, these are all official statistics. Of course, you can argue against the statistic agency, but I'm using it from the official data. And this is religion. Religion also play a role. Islam is about 88%, Christian 9%, Protestant and Catholic, Hindu, Buddhism, Confucianism, and others. These others are more than 400 native, mostly native religion, local religion. In Indonesia, like in Thailand, we have the Javanese having their own pre-Islam, pre-Hindu religion. The Batak, the Maduris, they all have pre-Hindu religion. Chapter 1, Aceh. If you are familiar with Indonesia, you will know one song. I'm not a good singer, but the song run like this. Dari Sabang sampai Merauke, berjajar pulau-pulau. From Sabang to Merauke, there are island after island. Every Indonesian knows that song. We are being taught to sing that song basically from kindergarten. So I started this trip from Sabang Island near Aceh. The Acehnese rebel against Indonesia, initially in the 1950s, but revived again in late 1970s. Their basic argument is that the Javanese cannot live by their own. The Javanese need the other islands to survive. With 62% of the population living on the island of Java, Indonesia total population is about 250 million. 62% living on this densely packed island. The Javanese need to expand. And thus they go to Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, etc. Thus, these Aceh nationalists argue that Indonesia is the pseudonym of Bangsa Jawa. Bangsa is nation, Java. So that is the reason for their rebellion. And of course, it ended with a tsunami in 2004. European Union brokered a peace agreement, and that peace agreement allowed Aceh to use Islamic Sharia as their legal mechanism. Thus, what we are seeing today is the rise of Islamic Sharia to discriminate Christian, non-Muslim minorities, in Aceh even to discriminate non-Sunni minorities, and even non-Shafi'i minorities. If you are Hanbali school of thought, Hanafi, or the others, you are discriminated too in Aceh. And last but not the least is LGBT. This is Indonesia founding Vice President Muhammad Hatta, who stressed that 2/3 of Indonesia population live in Java. But Java has only 7% of Indonesia landmass. This is a huge problem in Indonesia, the imbalance of their population. This is the war in Aceh. Many of you might cover the war. They got arms. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch estimated about 10,000 people were killed after the fall of Suharto, 1998. And this is the tsunami. How many years ago? 15 years ago, exactly. I was there. You know that it was very devastating. And this is what happened in Aceh today. Caning, LGBT, gay men, lesbian women, churches being closed down, Muslim minorities like Shia, Ahmadiyya, Ismailiyah, Druze, Gavatar, they are all banned. Many of them are running away from Aceh. Chapter 2, the killing of the Maduris. The Maduris are Sunni Muslim, like most other Indonesian. They were killed here. Why they were killed? After the fall of Suharto, indigenous Dayak communities who felt that they were marginalized under Suharto, they want to revive, quote-unquote, Dayak identity. Their main nemesis is the Malay, ethnic Malay. But the Dayak decided not to confront the Malay because the Malay also include Javanese. Many of them are soldiers, police officers. So they decided to take down a smaller migrant group, the Maduris. So the sentiment there that is being used is Maduris is trying to steal our lands. They like to steal. They are often using violence. So about 6,500 Maduris were killed. The killing were brutal. They were beheaded. In that book, I have some scene about how the Malay fellow Muslim kill fellow Muslim Maduris by cutting their back and grab out the heart of the victim to be eaten bit by bit. You might remember the killing, the beheading. 6,000 Maduris, 6,500 Maduris killed. The perpetrators initially were the Dayak, but later the Malay retaliated. Oh, again, not against the Dayak, but against the Maduris. This kind of logic is similar to what happened in the Sri Lanka bombing 2 months ago. Muslim in Sri Lanka, Muslim extremists of course, they felt that they are being discriminated against by the Buddhists. But they dare not to take the Buddhists, because if they take the Buddhist militant might retaliate and burning mosques, displacing Muslim. Thus, they bomb Catholic churches. This kind of logic happened in Kalimantan 20 years ago. So they show me all the Quranic verses that were put as their headband, believing that wearing those kind of magical words, they will be able to be brave and to do maseka. And this is Sulawesi Island, another island. The area saw ugly sectarian violence in the name of Islam, and Christianity. Sulawesi is interesting because that island is almost equally divided between Christian in the north and Muslim in the south. And the violence happened on the border, in the Poso area. Until now, we still have some jihadists operating in Poso area. They are also successful, I think, in trying to minimize the violence in Sulawesi, because next island is the Moluccas Island, where the biggest violence took place. 25,000 people were killed in the next island. So this is the Poso violence, Christian versus Muslim, killed at least 600, only 600. It is small for Indonesia, 600. Java, the most important island, the most populated, where all the myth about Indonesia was created, nationalism was created, the Declaration of Independence was created there in Jakarta. And of course, Jakarta is still the capital of the media, businesses, politics, military, startup companies. Some of the biggest startup companies in this part of the world originate from Jakarta. And the capital is sinking. You know, we are going to move our capital. 42% Javanese. So the idea is Java or the Javanese is the denominator of Indonesia. No? All the other ethnic groups can fight against the idea of Indonesiahood. All the other ethnic groups can campaign for the Islamic Sharia. All the other ethnic groups can set up rebellions, but not the Javanese, because the Javanese is the most important, the denominator of Indonesia. And of course, also in Java, we started the 1965 massacre, killing 1 million people. That was the mother of all violence in Indonesia. If you take a look at the history of many of these violence nationwide, you will see that they like to refer to 1965. So 1965 inspired many of these ethnic groups to conduct massacre. Well, also in Java, those many multiple ethnic groups were trying to promote the idea of Indonesia becoming an Islamic state. They did it in 1945, but failed. They also tried to do that after the fall of Suharto in 1998. But basically, many of the prominent Javanese offer the other ethnic group, why don't we vote in the National Assembly in 1999? Let's vote if we want to be a state based on what we claim to be Pancasila, the 5 principles, or we want to be a state based on what we call the Jakarta Charter, aka Islamic Sharia. The Islamists at the time declined to vote because they fear they might lose. And this is also the violence made by the Islamists, mostly coming from Java, the Bali bombing. But then the Islamists started to propose the idea, we cannot change Jakarta, we cannot change this Java-dominated Indonesia. What we can do, we can introduce Sharia regulation on the local level, especially after 2004 when autonomy law was introduced. So as of 2016, there are 421 Human Rights Watch call it discriminatory regulation in Indonesia. They call it Islamic Sharia. They discriminate 3 types of minorities. One is religious minorities, second is women, and the third is LGBT. We can see one of the most important indicator is the more and more women all over Indonesia wearing mandatory hijab. there are sanctions if you don't wear hijab. And over the last 20 years, this hijab regulation becoming darker, bigger, and longer. Right, Paul? Yeah. This is what we might see them more and more in Indonesia now. Many of these Sharia regulations started in Sumatra, where the sentiment against Java is deeply rooted. And they also used the blasphemy law to corner, as a political weapon, to corner their opponents. The biggest victim, of course, was then Jakarta Governor Basuki Purnama, alias Ahok, accused to commit blasphemy against Islam. And the Islamists managed to organize at least 500,000 people to protest in Jakarta. That was huge, 500,000 people. So the blasphemy law is being used against minorities, Sharia regulation. Another one is against non-Muslim minorities, Shia, Kafatar, Ahmadiyya emerged. And then also the so-called religious harmony regulation. It is another Sharia-inspired regulation. Religious harmony basically argue that the majority should protect the minorities. And the minorities should respect, should kowtow the majority. And the government set up the so-called Religious Harmony Forum to agree or to disagree in the setting up of new houses of worship, of course mostly churches, or religious festival, Shia celebration, Ahmadiyya celebration. They are all basically non-existing now after the introduction of this religious harmony, because by the principle of majority-minority, of course the majority representative in each this advisory forum has the veto power. If I want to renovate my Ahmadiyya mosque, I need to get the approval. If I want to wear Santa hat for Christmas celebration, I need to get their approval. If I want to renovate my church, I need to get their approval. Thus, with this regulation introduced in 2006, there are multiple data, but Tempo magazine estimated 2,200 churches being closed down since 2006. This is one of the churches that was closed down in Bogor. This is another data. You can see that Muslim mosques, according to the government data, is 78% of all houses of worship. Meanwhile, Muslim is 88% of the population. Christian, there are only 9%, but their churches is about 15% of all houses of worship. So, according to this Islamist point of view, they should be proportional. Thus, churches should be 9%, and mosques should be 88% in accordance to the percentage of the population. So that balance of churches is of course the biggest victim of them all, is about 5,000 churches. So in their rough calculation, they want to close down 5,000 churches. Indonesian author, most famous. But at the same time, because being soldiers, Java sent many soldiers to the outer island to clamp down rebellion. And in his word is murderous. And these are the source of hostility, hatred even, against Indonesia. No? This is like probably in Thailand with the South. The Bangkok government keep on sending soldiers. And obviously these soldiers are Buddhists. Meanwhile, the minorities in the South are Muslim. This is the story in Indonesia. No? But Pramudia reminded all of us, if Indonesia is to break up, wars will take place everywhere. Java has too many people, and they are mostly poor. No? And this is the biggest island, the Molucas Island. Jihadists, more than 5,000, were sent to the Molucas Island, killing 25,000. Yeah. 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 This is the photo of a police officer. Police officers there were mostly local. They are mostly Christian. The police were seen as siding with the local. Meanwhile, soldiers were seen as siding with the Muslim. Another violent place, of course, is Timor. Some historical background. The U.S. government agreed with Indonesia invading East Timor back in 1975. And then over the next 2 decades, according to the UN, 102,000 people died under Indonesian occupation. And then referendum was 1999. 78% voted against Indonesia. But East Timor independence is a trauma for many elite leaders in Java. No? They don't want East Timor to happen again. And next, this is the area that they are scared of the most, if it is to copy East Timor, West Papua. No? We know the biggest gold mine in the world is in Papua, Freeport, in Timika. And then Indonesia assassinated Papua most popular leader, Teis Eluai, in 2004. And now those who were involved in his murder, the commander of the squad at the time is now the chief intelligence of Indonesian armed forces. He is a lieutenant general. And many of those lower ranking officers involved in the assassination, they are all now either colonel or at least lieutenant colonel. The underlying issue in Papua is racism. Most Indonesians see dark-skinned, curly-haired people as inferior. They are primitive, they are semi-naked, they eat pork. So in a bid to pacify this indigenous Papuan, Indonesia sent, we call it transmigrant from Java to live along the border with PNG. So what we are seeing in Papua over the last 50 years is environmental degradation, marginalization of ethnic Papuan, HIV is on the rise, racism, discrimination against ethnic Papuan. Papuan businesses have difficulties to get bank loans. Many Papuan students have difficulties to enroll into better universities. Education quality is declining to be compared with the Dutch time. But I also see in my research that Papua resists Indonesian rule like Rizoma. Difficult to disrupt or to kill. And over the last 50 years, they keep on doing it. Sometimes they make killing, of course. Sometimes they suffer a lot. But these people are quite stubborn. They are quite resisting until now. So it is not shocking to know that Indonesia still restricts foreign journalists to go to Papua. I have to mention that because, you know, this is the club of foreign correspondents. Because of what happened inside. There are things that Indonesia hide inside Papua. The epilogue. So multiple ethnic and religious groups try to find new equilibrium in post-Suharto Indonesia, with political Islam, quote unquote, gaining most of the post-Suharto regulation. Institutionalized discrimination. Past human rights abuses are not addressed, culture of nurturing the culture of impunity. But democratic election helped decrease violence, but civil liberties, press freedom decline. Minorities are discriminated widely in Indonesia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas, for a sort of sweeping and very sobering overview of some of the most disturbing and striking currents in the country today. I guess one thing that, as we mentioned before, given the timing of the book, you had to cut off at least a year before, was it a year before this recent election? So I think one key question might be how, you've painted a very striking portrait of these tensions, ethnic and religious, that are festering away in these very distinct areas of Indonesia. Now we've had the election. Jokowi has won, but, again, bitterly sort of contested with a very sour loser there. That's another factor, and that, I guess, is more a purely political thing. So first, maybe you could perhaps address the issue of how you see all these, what seem to be intractable problems and, biases, prejudices and tensions that seem to flare up regularly, fitting in this post-election era where Jokowi has promised this, more reformist administration. I mean, do you feel more hopeful or less? How do you see all these key problem areas under this new old regime?
First of all, we need to know that quote-unquote Islamic voters is becoming more and more important, political Islam. It should not be a surprise that President Jokowi picked up Ma'ruf Amin, a hardline Muslim cleric, to be his vice president. Ma'ruf Amin was the one who issued anti-Ahmadiyya fatwa, anti-Shia statement, anti-then Jakarta Governor Ahok statement accusing him to commit blasphemy against Islam, pro-female genital mutilation, pro-mandatory hijab, anti-LGBT, all those anti-human rights statements. But still, President Jokowi picked him up as his running mate to burnish his Islamic credential. I don't think if Jokowi did not pick up this hardline cleric to be his deputy, I don't think he might win the election 2 months ago. That is the first. The second fact that we need to know is there is a Cornell University professor, name is Tom Papinski. He did an analysis of the voters using multiple data, survey, exit poll of Indonesia 514 regencies of 34 provinces. In short, it is very analytical, very statistical, but in short, those who voted President Jokowi had included 3 constituencies. One is, excuse me, the first one is ethnic Javanese. President Jokowi won big in Central and East Java, and of course Java is highly populated island. The second constituency is the Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest Muslim group, where Ma'ruf Amin belonged to. Nahdlatul Ulama are mainly Japanese, but they also have membership in the outer islands. The third constituency is Christian. According to one exit poll, Christian 91% voted for Jokowi. I guess out of fear, because Prabowo allied himself with the Islamists, the one who would like to increase the so-called Islamic Sharia in Indonesia. Meanwhile, Prabowo won big in Sumatra. This is the province the island that has the deepest anti-Javanese sentiment. He won about 90% in 2 provinces in Sumatra, Aceh and West Sumatra, Fiona. 90%. This is the biggest win for Prabowo. And of course, in Bali, Jokowi won 90% as well. But Bali is small, Hindu population. So ethnically, Prabowo got the vote from ethnic Acehnese, ethnic Minangkabau, Malay, Bugis, Banjar, and these are in general more conservative Muslim than the Javanese. So seeing all this data, we can see that the division within Indonesia is deepening. Unfortunately, it is also getting more and more discriminatory against religious minorities, and the fear against the Islamists is getting bigger and bigger. The Christians have no option but to vote the lesser evil of the two couple, the two duets.
I guess one odd contradiction, though, is you're saying that without the deal with a hardline Muslim cleric as his running mate, Jokowi may not have won, but you're also highlighting the fact that he attracted a very strong Christian vote, while Prabowo attracted the conservative Islamic vote. So actually, how does that fit with the fact that Indonesia now has a very hardline Muslim cleric who supports female, genital mutilation and other things as his vice president, and yet, seems to be a hope for the Christians?
Well, getting the Muslim vote, of course, is a must. You will never win an election without trying to appease the Muslim vote. That's why Ma'ruf Amin is there. But the Prabowo camp also understood very, very well that the tipping balance is the Christian. If Jokowi could secure, let's say, Javanese Muslim, and he will get 50%, and Prabowo will secure the other non-Muslim ethnic group, he will secure 50%. Then the winning vote should be the Christian. That's why Prabowo celebrated a Christmas party last December, Christmas time. His vice presidential candidate, Sandiaga Uno, even went into 3 different churches, different big churches, different denomination, lighting up a Christmas candle or whatever, because they need Christian vote as well. And of course, Prabowo come from a Christian family. He has 1 brother and 2 sisters. They are all Christian. His mother is a Christian. His father is a Javanese Muslim. Thus, he also would like to get some Islamic link. And in some of his major speeches, he said, "How can you say that I am a supporter of the Caliphate?" In Indonesia, supporting Islamic State the term is khilafah. How do you people accuse me of supporting the khilafah? It is, I come from a Christian family, So he is also trying to get Muslim vote. But if you take a look at his rallies, and this is a concern among his allies, the banner that they raised was the Hizbut Tahrir banner, the black flag, which is rather similar with the ISIS flag. That is his rallies.
So given all that, and we'll turn the floor over to questions in a minute, but perhaps I could just ask you one more thing. Given what you just said, what's your prognosis for the future? Are you less or more optimistic? And what does happen to that very sour, dark force that Prabowo has come to represent, so bitter about the elections and still with some significant support in certain areas?
I predict the areas where Islamism is rising, they will have economic slowdown.
Such as what? Aceh?
Aceh, West Sumatra, Southern Sumatra, West Nusa Tenggara, Lombok Island, and South Kalimantan. Basically, where there are mandatory hijab regulation, they will have a slower economic growth. Why? One is, of course, foreign investment is quite nervous to see all of this Sharia regulation. But another 2 other problem is child marriage is rising, because the Islamists, they don't want to have what they call zina, or sex outside of marriage, even among singles. So thus, in a bid to avoid zina, adultery, sex before marriage, they lower. They tolerate child marriage. And child marriage is increasing. You will have more women dropping out of school, poverty, of course. FGM, female genital mutilation, is rising, meaning reproductive health is affected. There are more and more cases of women having myom, mild cancer, because of reproductive health. And then we have more and more so-called economic Sharia. Theaters are closed down, beaches are separated, swimming pool are being, they say that every other day they have to change, but later, of course, only for men. So all of this discrimination against women is going to affect the economy. You don't need to be as smart as Max Weber to understand this kind of argument. It happened in Europe. So that is what I imagine will happen in those conservative areas. Meanwhile, the more secular areas, or let's say the 60-40% areas, they will have higher economic growth. Places like Kalimantan or Papua or Bali, of course, East Nusa Tenggara, they will grow economically higher than the other provinces.
Right. So therefore, are you more or less optimistic for the next 5 years?
The minorities will still suffer, because I don't think President Jokowi will spend enough political capital to undo the discrimination produced over the last 2 decades. On the record, the president that introduced most of the Sharia regulation was President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. It is already a book. John Macbeth, a veteran correspondent in Jakarta, wrote a book about SBY legacy.
Right, okay. Well, I won't press you any more on that. Maybe some questions. Yes, please start and identify yourself.
I'm Rudy, Orang Belanda. I met Gus Dur in my student days in Leiden. And later in Indonesia. We traveled quite a lot together before he became president. I also met Habibie and Megawati. What went wrong? Those were nice, moderate people. I remember Gus Dur in Leiden. We went to soccer matches together. He was a young guy. He was what I would call like Italian or Catholic. He was an Indonesian Muslim, he was easygoing. He even had a beer now and then. So what went wrong in all those years? After, Gus Dur, Wahid, Megawati, and Habibie. What went wrong?
All this discrimination started under President SBY, who succeeded Megawati. So after the fall of Suharto, we briefly have Habibie as Habibie vice president, Suharto vice president, and then Gus Dur was in power for only 22 months, and then Megawati in power for 3 years. So very brief period. At that period, there was so much violence. Now, talking about Gus Dur, the late President Abdurrahman Wahid, of course, he is a great Muslim scholar, if not the greatest that Indonesia had ever produced. I visited Indonesia President Graveyard, Soekarno, Suharto, and Gus Dur. Soekarno is in Blitar, East Java. Suharto in Solo, Central Java, Tawangmangu, near Solo. And then Gus Dur is in Jombang, East Java. I tried to calculate how many people visited their cemeteries. Suharto is the least, maybe about 20-30 people every day. Soekarno is pretty big, maybe 500 every day. You can guess how many visit Gus Dur graveyard every day? At least 100 buses. 100 buses. The parking space enough for 200. In weekends, dozens of thousands of people visited Gus Dur graveyard. It means that Gus Dur is more popular than Suharto and Soekarno. someone who ruled only 22 months, but he introduced so many reforms in his short period of time to be compared with Suharto, 33 years in power.
So, what did happen?
Gus Dur tried to revoke the blasphemy law. He failed. Gus Dur tried to dismiss the Ministry of Religious Affairs. He failed, though, because he considered Ministry of Religious Affairs is facilitating discrimination. But he was successful in revoking the ban against Jehovah's Witness, Confucianism, and some other smaller religion. He revoked them. He also introduced anti-corruption drive in Indonesia. Unfortunately, it was also Gus Dur who agreed to have Aceh implementing the Islamic Sharia, despite he consistently refused Islamic Sharia to be introduced in his homeland, Java.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Michael.
Sorry, Michael Mackey, freelance. This is a very fragmented picture that you're painting, worse than Yugoslavia, worse maybe even than the breakup of the former Soviet Union. But there's one element that you seem to have missed. When Suharto fell, the rage that was sometimes directed was directed towards ethnic Chinese. It was similarly this case in 1965. Are you noticing are we seeing a quantitative change away from ethnic discrimination towards religious discrimination? That's my first question, if you'd like to answer that.
Ethnic Chinese is the longest discriminated against ethnic group in Indonesia. It happened since the Dutch time. What many Indonesians fail to understand by keeping this idea of discriminating ethnic Chinese, that it can be copied against other migrants. As Indonesia is having independence and then growing geographically, ethnic are more distributed all over Indonesia. People move. That same idea to discriminate the others, the migrants, is taking root. Thus, we have anti-Javanese campaign in Aceh, 30,000 Javanese running away from Aceh. Or the anti-Maduris violence, more than 200,000 Maduris running away from Kalimantan. Or the so-called BBM group. BBM stands for Bugis Buton Makassaris, running away from the Moluccas Island because they are Muslim. So the idea to discriminate ethnic Chinese is now being copied against any others among many of these, let's say, indigenous people. They are not indigenous. They are, in Indonesia we call it putra daerah, the son of the soil. Is it moving from ethnicity to religion? It doesn't change, I think. What we are seeing now, double type of discrimination. One is based on ethnicity, and the other one is based on religion. In many areas, for instance, Sambas Regency in Kalimantan, ethnic Maduris until now cannot return, cannot just even enter Sambas. You might be killed for entering Sambas, for ethnic Maduris. So this kind of racism, violent racism, discrimination is still happen. In central Kalimantan, there is a regulation that says ethnic Maduris cannot have any other union, any Maduris association until 25 years after the killing of 2001. Right now, some ethnic Maduris in central Kalimantan, they would like to set up, just informal ethnic Maduris association. Just last month, it was rejected. There were protests against that idea. It also happened in Papua. It happened in Sulawesi and many other islands.
Okay, and that doesn't give me, on a night when we've just had Boris Johnson elected British Prime Minister, that's another thing to worry about. Thank you very much. The other question I was going to raise is, it's again twofold. When we've had Filipino speakers here, they've sometimes referred to Imperial Manila. Do people in Indonesia think of Imperial Jakarta? Because some years ago, I heard people, liberal leftists, for heaven's sake, some of them might even have been known to me, who referred to Indonesia as effectively the Javanese empire. Is there a feeling of this being a kind of political struggle against a political entity complicated by race? And the other thing I was going to ask is, we've also had discussions here about the situation in the south. One of the worrying trends at the south of Thailand, as opposed to the south of England, I would like to point out, or the south of Ireland, given what we're going to have to do with the border if Boris Johnson gets his way. Is there any fear that this situation is being manipulated or exploited by the remnants of Daesh or Al-Qaeda?
The more neutral term regarding this so-called Imperial Manila in Indonesia is more neutral. It is called pusat. Pusat is center. So people like to say pusat and daerah. Daerah is local. Orang pusat, people from the center. That is quite neutral, I guess. But the more racist term is, of course, using the term Bangsa Jawa, Java nation. In Papua, they like to call the Javanese as, you might know that the Javanese, when they say please, they use the word Monggo. Anyone familiar with Javanese language? Monggo, please, please. And the Papuan call the Javanese si Monggo. As if the spider, the verb connotate as the spider with so many hands. So that kind of thing is alive. And of course, in Sumatra, anti-Javanese sentiment is very deep. Of all islands that I visited, in Papua, it is more anti-Indonesia as a quote-unquote colonial master. But in Sumatra, it is anti-Javanese. The last question is, are people manipulating ethnicity and Islam?
Specifically, I wanted to know, are outsiders? And you raised an interesting point. Is it being manipulated internally by politicians?
Indonesian politician?
Yes.
Oh yes, of course. The title of the book, Race, Islam, and Power. So in a bid to get power, these people dare to manipulate, they're not ashamed to manipulate ethnicity and Islam to get power. Power, political power, economic power, social power, government job, palm oil plantation licenses, land grabbing licenses, mining licenses, mining permit. So these are the sources of course, money in Indonesia. So we are manipulating ethnicity and Islam to get power. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Andreas. My name is Imtiaz Muqbil. I cover the travel and tourism industry. I'm a life member of the club. I have two questions. The first, a very short one. Is your book available in Indonesia? And if so, how is it selling?
It is available at Periplus bookstore.
Nobody's tried to ban it or
I hope so.
Or shoot? Or have you shot?
No, not yet. The sale is not
Any threats against you, by any chance? Any threats against you?
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, it's part of my business, receiving threat as a human rights watch person.
Can I just ask you to wear your Human Rights Watch hat for a minute and just look at this whole issue of extremism at a broader global level? What you're describing in Indonesia is today almost a global phenomenon. Buddhist extremists in Burma, Hindu nationalist extremists in India, right-wing immigrants, anti-immigrant parties in Europe, white supremacists shooting people in America.
do you see similarities? Is there a similar vein? Are these people driven by some deep psychological insecurities? Are they following the same agenda of trying to demonize minorities? Is there some common thread that binds these people across the world? Because it all seems to be ending with the same thing. They're all driven by some kind of demon on their backs, and they're all violent in their own way. And it's not possible to actually compartmentalize them because they cut across all colors, creeds, ethnicities, and it's been going on for centuries, and it's still going on. So while it's good to focus on Indonesia, I was just wondering whether you see any common thread in the fact that it seems to be becoming a major phenomena in the geopolitics of the first 2 decades of the 21st century as well, which is quite not what was expected when the Cold War ended, and everybody thought that this was going to be an era of freedom and democracy and capitalism, and the whole nirvana was going to reign. Whereas in actual fact, all these new walls are beginning to emerge after the Berlin Wall fell, and this is not what was expected to happen, and it's all similar. So would you like to analyze from a broader level, why do you think this is happening at a global level?
It is difficult to compare all of the region that you mentioned because the factors are quite diverse. We can make a rather limited comparison by, let's say, seeing the blasphemy law. The use of the blasphemy law in Indonesia and Pakistan is quite similar. We can compare the so-called religious harmony regulation in Indonesia or some other countries. They are quite similar. Or if we see the decline of press freedom in Southeast Asia, I think there are similarities in Myanmar, in Thailand, I'm afraid, Cambodia, the closure of Cambodia Daily, the buying of Cambodia Daily, Phnom Penh Post, and those radio stations. I think there are similarities. But to make a global comparison, I'm afraid I'm not equipped with enough data and multiple comparison to make a proper analysis about what happened globally.
Can I just leap in there, though, because given your earlier experiences covering Myanmar, or Burma as it was back then, and what you were saying about Papua, West Papua, and also the contempt for dark, curly-haired people, but you must have seen in Myanmar that beyond the religion and other sort of factors, it seems, and also with Dalits in India and other things, it's always like this contempt for the, almost like looking down on the physical thing has also driven a lot of that. But Indonesians are so diverse; it seems extraordinary that you see what I mean? That Myanmar is also very diverse, but not as diverse as Indonesia. And you've got very dark and curly-haired Javanese, Achenese, But you made a particular point about the West Papua situation. And I don't know if you saw it in action in Myanmar and how much Burmese hate, generally there's a huge issue about Rohingya Muslims and...
The racism against Papuan is widespread, not only among Indonesians living in Papua, but also Papuan who live on islands of Java. I like to observe languages. I like to observe words or body language. Many Indonesians, when they see Papuan, they like to try to close their nose as if these people are smelly. And many Indonesians, you can read many academic papers, they consider ethnic Papuan to be smelly. That they're trying to use pseudoscience that the sweat of dark-skinned people is worse than lighter-skinned people. So that kind of thing. And of course, the portrayal of Papuan among Indonesian media and film is also racist. There is an Indonesian film produced by a Javanese who live in Papua. It is about a group of geologists trying to find mineral in Papua. And they were kidnapped by a group of indigenous Papuan who have never met outsiders. And the member of this particular indigenous people are only women. If they want to have children, this woman-only group, they have to kidnap fellow Papuan men to make them pregnant. So when they can kidnap these Indonesian geologists, light-skinned, straight-haired people like me, and this Papuan woman in the film say that we have to make our children better. Let's make all these men making us pregnant. So that kind of racism. And it was played in Indonesian movie. You take a look at Indonesian media. I have to mention, I don't want to mention name, but mainstream Indonesian media, the big name. That kind of racism is there. That the Papuan are basically stupid, corrupt, the men womanizers, gambling, drunken, because they're Christian, they drink alcohol, always being portrayed as drunkard.
Well, that that seems to be a specific sort of racism that applies.
I guess you all know that foreign journalists have difficulties to go to Papua, right? You all know that. And it's been 50 years.
Yeah.
I tried 5 times between 2006 2011. Never once. No visas. Anywhere else I could go.
As an Indonesian, I have to apologize.
Dues-paying members of the United Nations.
Yeah. I'm
So-
sorry. No.
It's not your. Andrew.
Thank you. Hi, thanks, Andreas.
Yeah, just identify yourself.
Sorry, Andrew from Engage Media. Based on your presentation, seemingly Indonesian civil society has been relatively ineffective at pushing back against these trends. Would you say that that's correct? And if
Yes.
so, why has Indonesian civil society not been effective at kind of creating another narrative or a kind of opposition to this trend?
I think for this time being, many of these civil society organizations are confused. Many of Indonesian journalists are confused. You can Google, there are survey after survey of Indonesian journalists, whether they agree with Indonesian Ulama Council fatwa. 90% agree. Whether they agree that the Ahmadiyah should be banned. 70% agree. Whether they agree that Muslim Shia, these are Indonesian journalists, Shia Muslim should be banned. Whether they agree with polygamy, 35% agree. So the biases among not only Indonesian journalists, but you can go survey after survey, profession after profession, police, soldiers, teachers. Oh, teachers is very bad. 90% of Indonesian teachers do not want to have non-Muslim as their supervisors. 90%. Principal, school supervisors. And there are many surveys that say increasingly Muslims do not want to have Christian as their neighbors. And of course, if Muslims are being questioned, do you agree if a church is being set up in your neighborhood? The percentage is very high. So my answer is that many of these civil society organizations, they are confused. Many journalists cannot differentiate between their profession and their faith. And of course, the understanding of Islam is very artificial. Islam has a very rich tradition. If you read the rich literature of Islam, you will know that some Ottoman sultan were gay, openly gay men, and nothing happened. There is no conclusion within Islamic scholars over centuries about the definition of aurat. Aurat is scar, in Arabic means scar. This is some interpret aurat as hair, some as skin, some as body shape, boobs or hip. So there is no conclusive agreement about the Quranic word aurat, what should be covered. Though? Some goes to the extreme that voice and gaze of Muslim women should be covered. Some say that aurat is basically public security. If the public is secure from catcalling, women need not to cover up. Women need not to wear hijab. So there are so many rich interpretations of Islam, and many of these people are confused about Islam.
And I mean, I guess when I said civil society, I actually meant a kind of a slightly thinner layer of people in the terms of the human rights activists, maybe the activists, journalists, the artists, the people who are kind of propagating more open ideas. They don't seem to have been able to push back or create new narratives effectively. So what are those groups doing wrong or ineffectively that they are seemingly kind of very much pushing against the wind?
What is the question?
Well, I mean, why is, I guess, would you say that the human rights activists, the NGOs, that level of civil society, the kind of are being effective or not in pushing against these trends? It seems not, based on your presentation, and why not?
Well, yeah, he's basically asking you to assess whether groups like yours
You and your
and
friends.
other NGOs are actually
they are
helping
confused.
to push back against.
They are confused. They are confused between their human rights education, human rights values, and their traditional values, ethnicities, Islam in this case. Many of them are confused. It might take time for them to realize that there is something wrong with our country.
That means they're not being effective.
Yes. You might know that in every religious regime, whether it is in the name of Christianity, in the name of Islam, Buddhism, whatever, once they are in power, the first thing that they are going to rule, you know what? Woman bodies, right? Woman bodies, regulating women. So thus, the introduction of this, many of Islamic Sharia regulation, proportionately the biggest part of this Sharia regulation is about women. From, virginity testing to mandatory hijab, female FGM, female genital mutilation, polygamy, child marriage, consensual sex outside of marriage. These are all about women bodies. So they don't realize that with all of this regulation, we are going to hamper economic development. You cannot discriminate half of the population to grow economically.
Yeah, but I think one of the problems is that these sort of things have to be legislated, and what politicians are going to stand up for that and introduce legislation in Parliament?
No one does.
What proportion are women in Indonesian Parliament? Right?
It is 10% maybe.
Yeah, 10%, if that.
Yeah. Many of these, I have the list of all the regulation on mandatory hijab. There are 69 regulation, and only one is signed by a woman.
Yeah. Right. Well, there you go. Sir.
Doug Sanders from Mahidol University. Is there your book is for sale in Periplus, which is really a high quality book chain. Is there a liberal press surviving in Indonesia these days? Compass has been very good at times. Are they squeezed at this point, or are they simply a surviving minority voice which doesn't have much impact? Are they being cut back or just ignored for this period?
We have one new factor in terms of media, I think globally. It is the arrival of the internet. The arrival of the internet, Google, Facebook, put a lot of financial pressure on many of these traditional news organizations. They are running, they don't have as much profit as they used to be. It squeezed the newsroom. It pressured journalists to produce more news report every day to be compared with what happened 20 years ago. And then because of the arrival of the internet, business models are changing. We are seeing more and newer players who are more savvy in dealing with this millennial cell phone users. Kompas is squeezed, Jakarta Post is squeezed, Tempo is squeezed. That is one factor that make the quality of journalism is declining in Indonesia. No? Internet.
Right. Okay. Thank
Klaus?
you.
Hi, my name is Klaus Blog. I'm an Asia correspondent for the Danish newspaper Politiken.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Could you repeat that?
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
My name is Klaus Blog. I'm Asia correspondent for the Danish newspaper Politiken. It's a kind of Danish equivalent to The Guardian, to give you an idea. As a journalist based here, it's a daily struggle to make people in my part of the world interested in Asia. I mean, people do care about Europe and the US, and if they care about Asia, they care about China and forget about the rest of Asia. And I think you have done a tremendously, courageous work with your book. But I would like to ask you about the big picture, because I was in Indonesia last year. I was joining one of those huge demonstrations organized by the Islamic groups, and there were tens and thousands of people there. It was really shocking. And in your book and in your presentations, you have very much described the situation in different parts of Indonesia, but in the big picture, do you think that Indonesia will be a hot spot in the future, especially compared to what's going on in other countries in this region, like in Malaysia? I just came back from India last week. I talked to Muslims there who are extremely afraid of the Modi government, about what's going on in the Philippines and the southern Thailand as well, with how Rohingyas are being used among Muslim groups in Malaysia and Indonesia. Do you think that we're actually missing the point about what's going on in your part of Asia, that actually Indonesia will become some kind of new, I wouldn't say Middle East, but at least a hot spot in the future? Is there a point that we're missing here in a broader sense?
I don't think so. If we take a look at history, Southeast Asia, Indonesia especially, is always a trading road. And Indonesia, Malaysia, I think archipelago, Southeast Asia archipelago, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, is always at the crossroad of Hindu civilization, Buddhist civilization, Islamic civilization, Chinese, of course, Western civilization. Because of that, this is a region that basically changed majority religion 3 times in 2,000 years. That is quite something. And many parts of Indonesia are now, since that time, become predominantly Christian. There are 34 provinces, and 4 are Christian provinces, Papua, West Papua, and 1 Hindu, of course, Hindu Bali. But my argument can be flawed if there is economic crisis. If we take a look at violence in Indonesia, it is always triggered by economic crisis. 98, Suharto fell down from power, triggered by the Asian economic crisis. 65, the fall of Soekarno, it was the Cold War. Inflation at the time, 600%. And of course, later, Vietnam War exploded in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. World War II also, because of economic crisis, because of global situation. What happened in a large archipelago like Indonesia, changes are growing very slowly, very gradually. But if there are outside indicators, outside influence, in this case, economy, economic crisis will trigger a social crisis. Food stock will disappear from supermarket, from the market, and then a social crisis will trigger a political crisis. And usually after a political crisis, there is widespread violence. That is what I have seen in Indonesia during my study. But there is another indicator that can change the situation. It is huge natural disaster. The tsunami in Aceh basically ended the war. Without the tsunami, the Aceh War did not end in 2004. If we have a big natural disaster or we have a big war in this part of the world, then Indonesia will change. Even borders might be changed. Right now, it is very gradual. The Islamists discriminate minorities, but it doesn't affect the neighboring countries.
Thank you. Thank you. One more. Please identify yourself.
Good evening. My name is Christine Cabasset from the French Research Institute on Contemporary Southeast Asia, based in Bangkok. My question is, you said that Islam, the Islam population was, Muslim population was representing about 88%. But this figure, if I'm not wrong, this figure has been the same for at least 25 years or more, since the early 80s or even before. So my guess is that we don't know exactly what is the population, I mean the Muslim population. The second question is, since Pak Jokowi cannot be candidate anymore for the next election, because it's a second term, and Mr. Prabowo probably, I mean, because of his age, probably cannot also be candidate. How would you see the next election? Because there were actually not many candidates, only 2 pairs, so that's very worrying, I would say. And how, in this context, how do you see the role of the millennium, for instance?
Yes, please.
You mean the role of millennials or
The millennials.
the millennials, young voters?
Regarding the percentage of Muslim and many other religious groups in Indonesia, you are right that this 88% doesn't change over the last 50 years, not 50 years, 30 years. The question is, the interesting thing is not why it doesn't change. The question is when it changed and why. The biggest change happened between 1965 until 1988, the fall of Suharto. The number of Christians increased. There are already analyses about this by demographers, mostly from Singapore, that the number of Christians increased because of the 1965 crackdown against the communists and against the Chinese. The Chinese, many of them converted from Buddhism to Christianity. So the number of Christians increased slightly because of the Chinese. Confucian was banned, so many of the Confucian became Christian. And the second category that converted into Christianity is the communists. Many Catholic churches, especially, but also Protestant churches, help communist families between 1965 and 1988. Many of these communists, maybe before that, officially Muslim, they converted into Christianity. Thus, the number of Christians was growing. In fact, over the last 70 years, Christianity is the religion that grows the most in Indonesia. That worry the Muslims so much. Now, regarding the census, we have comprehensive census only in 1930 under the Dutch, and then 2000 and 2010. So the census are not perfect, of course. And in fact, the definition of most or Christian or Islam are not satisfactory. You know. Many criticisms were launched against the census agency at the time. So at least for this time being, let's take it for granted that it is still 88%. Politically, it is safe because it will not enrich the Muslim when they realize that the number had decreased once again. Another point is that among demographers, when did the number of Muslims increase significantly in Indonesia? it happened under the Dutch, when the Dutch made it mandatory for all people within the Netherlands Indies to have a religion. Thus, there is a term among the Muslim, among political scientists, abangan Islam. So in Indonesia, the Muslims are categorized as abangan Islam. They are only Islam on paper, but they still practice basically pre-Islam religion. What is it? Incense, using...
animistic.
Whatever. I don't like that term. And then, of course, Islam Santri. Islam Santri is the more Arabic Muslim. And Islam Priyayi. So there are many Islam in Indonesia. Who will run 5 years from now? On the Prabowo camp, they have Anies Baswedan, the current governor of Indonesia, who defeated Ahok using the blasphemy law. And they also have Sandiaga Uno, the losing vice presidential candidate, of a tycoon who financed almost 90% of the campaign this year and last year. On the Jokowi side, there are more names. I don't know. There are still many speculation. Although, like it or not, Jokowi's successor should be approved by Megawati, of course, the daughter of Soekarno. Megawati is the matriarch of the PDIP, the ruling party now. So maybe one of Megawati's son might run, or maybe one of Megawati's nephews, they are all men, to run, or maybe even her daughter, although in the more and more patriarchal Indonesia, it is difficult to imagine to have another female president. Thank you. Oh, the millennial. There are some research about the millennials. These millennials are less influenced by the old politics to some degree. The most encouraging sign is that the university student among the millennial, not general millennial, the ones that are educated well, they tend to be less anti-LGBT. That is very encouraging, because LGBT sentiment in Indonesia is very, very high. 90% disagree with homosexuality in Indonesia. But the lower class of this millennial, they are more or less still similar with their parents in general. They are also as devout as their parents. They are also as political Islam as their parents, or moderate Islam as their parents. It depends on ethnicity, ethnic group. The Javanese tend to be more moderate than the Sumatran. The Christian also tend to be like their Christian parents, also anti-LGBT in Indonesia. Don't get me wrong, but Christian in Indonesia are also very anti-LGBT. If I mention LGBT because obviously LGBT is a very good indicator to show, let's say, liberal values. Am I wrong with that, or
No, I think you're right.
accepting homosexuality is a liberal value?
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. Oh, okay. Okay, that's your third, final,
Gwen,
and then after that we might
No need
finish.
to say it like that, Gwen. No need to say it like that. I'm not your favourite person tonight, but there's no need to say it like that.
No Boris Johnson again.
Just a quick question, and it's my fault because I interrupted you. Is there any influence of foreign involvement in this? For example, Daesh warriors or Islamic State support? Because you mentioned the black flags, and I'm just curious as to why that would come into it. Thank you. And it was quick, Gwen.
Yes, thanks, Michael.
It is not a big issue in Indonesia, the influence of the black flag, for instance. It is taken for granted lately. Some people might use foreign influence as a pretext to pursue their their respective agenda. But in general, the brand of Islamism that come from the Middle East is not seen as something that has to be how should I call it, repressed. But by the way, 2 years ago, the Jokowi administration banned Hizbut Tahrir. This is a global Islamist organization. Hizbut Tahrir is banned in Indonesia now, and they filed a lawsuit. They lost in the court. Is that what you meant? Yeah.
Right. Okay, Paul. Fine.
The last question. Paul Risley with FCCT. At the end of the East Timor violence, there was a special tribunal set up that had both international and national characteristics, and there were indictments made of serving Indonesian officers. Whatever became
Can you
of that,
stand closer to the microphone, Paul, please?
whatever became of those indictments? Was there ever any action based on that tribunal, and does it still sit?
There was an agreement made between then President Shanana Gusmao of East Timor and President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono of Indonesia. They basically agreed to put aside the UN recommendation, the UN findings, and they instead agreed to set up the Commission of Peace and Reconciliation, of peace, not the truth. The UN used the term the truth and reconciliation. Indonesia and East Timor used the term peace and reconciliation. There were some trials, some kangaroo trial, but all Indonesian generals that were prosecuted by Indonesian Public Prosecutor Office, they were all acquitted. Meanwhile, the prosecutor office only charged middle-ranking officer. The general, they were not mentioned at all. That's why we have Wiranto, then the Armed Forces Commander, now the Chief Security Minister in Indonesia. Oh, of course, Prabowo. Prabowo is even running for president. So it is sad, but things happen. My own analysis, what can East Timor do? A tiny nation surrounded by a hostile country like Indonesia.
But it's really about accountability for the big nation state of Indonesia.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. They don't want to be held accountable. They accuse Australia, for my God's sake.
No, and rightly so.
And
Well,
they accuse Australia and the US. Why they made us invading East Timor back in 1975?
So actually, that was the last question. But since that was also it came up earlier about the status of certain things like laws, I was going to also ask, what is the status now of that adultery law? Because it was about to go through, and then it all kind of, we lost track of it. It was very difficult to follow. Is it, or is it not through, or has it carried over to a new parliament, or?
It is very likely to be carried over by the new parliament.
So this is the not just LGBT, but
the
extramarital sex, premarital sex, etc.
You might know that the Indonesian parliament would like to pass a new criminal code overhauling the 9198 that's in this made criminal code, but it adopted many of Sharia principles like criminalizing sex outside of marriage, also among single. Homosexuality is going to be criminalized, and many others. Among the Islamists, what they claim to be Kanun Jinayah or criminal code is the crown of Islamic Sharia. So they push so much that criminalizing on sensual sex is to be a crime in Indonesia. But EU objected, the UN also objected. The UN came to Indonesia, the UN Human Rights Chief, Said Hussein al-Hussein, himself a Muslim, of course, and because of his lobbying with President Jokowi, basically that criminal code was shelved. But we don't know whether it might be revived again later this year or next year, because this is a constant agenda among the Islamists. Right. Remember that criminal code is the crown of Islamic Sharia.
Right. Okay, well that's one to watch for. Well, can I just give Andreas a huge thanks for really, really very comprehensive. Come back anytime.
Terima kasih.
And books are still up there if anyone wants to grab one.
Thank you.
For money.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andreas.